So good morning and assalamu alaikum to everyone who's joining us from the US, and a very good evening and warm welcome to our friends who are joining us from Pakistan and the region. My name is Mehlaqa Samdani. I am the Director of Critical Connections, a nonprofit organization in Western Massachusetts that builds community and awareness around issues affecting Muslim communities. Our program today, Jihad versus Just War, is brought to you in partnership with Pakistan's National Model OIC. For those who are unfamiliar, OIC stands for the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, an intergovernmental body which is made up of 57 member states, 49 of which are Muslim majority countries. National Model OICs seek to facilitate simulations in Muslim majority countries and provide space for future OIC leaders to engage in critical issues affecting them. So for Critical Connections, it's quite an honor and a huge privilege to be engaging and partnering with these amazing group of youth leaders, and some of whom you will be introduced to in a little bit. So our event is actually part of our Critical Issues in Context series, which will take a deep dive into contentious issues affecting Muslim communities in both majority and minority contexts. Some of the other topics include questions of blasphemy, the rights of religious minorities, gender justice, and sectarianism in Islam. As is the case with our topic today, the discourse surrounding a lot of these issues is often dominated by Islamophobic groups and also militant organizations. And so we're really trying to sort of reclaim the narrative here and provide space for our audience and empower them to be able to engage in these conversations in a more nuanced and in a more contextualized way. And so we hope that you will sign up for other events in our series as well. Our series is also, I should note, made possible through the generous support of the Markham Nathan Fund for Social Justice here in Western Massachusetts. The discussion today will be moderated by Rutaba, who is a leading youth scholar and activist in Pakistan. Rutaba has a graduate degree in international relations from Karachi University and currently serves as the country coordinator for OIC's official youth forum. She is also Asia's regional chairperson at the International Association of Political Science Students. Before I turn it over to Rutaba, I'm just going to quickly describe the format of our event today. So for the next 50 to 55 minutes, Rutaba is going to be asking Dr. Hashmi, our very distinguished speaker, a series of questions, after which we will open it up for audience Q&A. We will request our audience to please keep themselves muted and submit your questions through the chat function here, and we will try and get to as many as possible. We also have people joining us on Facebook Live, so we'll be moderating that space as well. So without further ado, again, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm now going to turn it over to Rutaba.
Thank you, Melka. So, jihad and just war. The mere use of these words elicits an array of emotions. I mean, what kind of emotions and imagery may vary depending on who you are or how you first got associated with these terms. But the undeniable truth, ladies and gentlemen, is their ubiquitous presence in our lives. The fact is that jihad and just war are two ideas that are almost always lurking in the shadows of world politics, ceaselessly shaping and reshaping it. Yet interdisciplinary inquiries, especially between Western and Islamic legal traditions, have hardly been met with sincere collaborative approach. Today, our objective is to break away from this convention and into the critical, hopefully en route to a path that fosters mutual understanding. Today, we aim to ask ourselves questions around the essence of jihad and just war, where the two collide or conjoin, and in doing so, unpack what are some of the most deeply complex ethical and moral issues facing our world today. And ladies and gentlemen, what an honor it is to be having this all-important conversation with our esteemed guest tonight, or morning, depending on where you are, with a man who spent his life exploring ideas of war and peace, ethics and law and world politics for quite some time now. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Hashmi to you. Sohail Hashmi is a professor of international relations on the Alumni Foundation and a professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College, where he has taught since 1994. And if I know my audience, that is before even some of us were born. Hashmi's research and teaching focuses on comparative international ethics, particularly concepts of just war and peace, and on the study of religion and politics, particularly Islam in domestic and international politics. He has published on a range of topics in Islamic ethics and political theory, including sovereignty, international humanitarian interventions, tolerance, civil society, and the theory of jihad. His most recent book is an edited volume titled Just Wars, Holy Wars, and Jihads: Christian, Jewish, and Muslim encounters and exchanges. He's currently working on a book analyzing Muslim response to the rise of international law. Hashmi received a bachelor and PhD in political science from Harvard and a master's in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton. His list of fellowships, publication, write-ups is far longer than time permits me to get into. But he is most certainly an excellent authority on the topic we have on our hands today. And for that, we are grateful for his presence. Dr. Hashmi, thank you so much and welcome to Critical Issues in Context. How are you?
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much, Rutaba. That was a very gracious introduction, far better than I deserve. I appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you. Unfortunately, I can only see a few of you at a time. So as we go into the Q&A session, I hope to be able to see whoever is not currently on my screen and get to know a little bit better about the Model OIC program that you're all a part of. So,
for sure. Definitely, definitely. It's a pleasure to have you here. So Dr. Hashmi, I would like to start the conversation by asking you something very foundational here. And I want to ask you, how did the doctrines of jihad and just war develop in the Islamic and Western legal traditions respectively?
So if we are talking about origins, we should begin by just mentioning the reality, the fact that questions of just war or issues of the legality or the morality of war are part of every civilization's ethical discourse. Every major civilization on this planet has at various times produced discourse or literature on when war is legitimate and how to fight it morally. Two of the most well-developed traditions in the world, I think without doubt, are the just war tradition as it has evolved in the West and the jihad tradition as it has evolved in Muslim civilizations. So if you look across the world, there are of course other traditions of just war, but none are as detailed and none are as perhaps as vibrant in their moral reasoning as we see in the just war and jihad traditions. So one thing we need to understand very immediately and carefully, and that is that just war and jihad thinking are not in any way incompatible. The two traditions are extremely alike in terms of the way they reason morally about when war is proper and how to fight it. And in fact, they have interacted with one another over the centuries as both traditions evolved. Now, in terms of the origins, just war thinking in the West is more ancient because its roots lie in the Greek and Roman civilizations of ancient times. When Christianity developed and began to confront issues of legitimate warfare, Christians had a peculiar issue, which was not one that Jews and Muslims have confronted in their traditions. And that is that the Gospels, the traditions of what Jesus Christ is recorded to have said to his followers, they are quite averse to any kind of violence, let alone warfare. The ethic of the Gospels, the ethic of the New Testament seems to be very heavily biased in the pacifist direction. That is, war is not something that Christians should undertake as a proper exercise if they are true Christians. So in the Christian tradition, starting in about the 5th century or so, when the early church fathers had to confront whether or not Christians can actually wage war. And remember, at this point, Christianity was the religion of the Roman Empire. It had become the official faith of the Roman Empire. So if you are ruling a vast empire, such as the Romans were at that time, then of course you needed to confront the issue of warfare. We all know that the Romans waged warfare routinely as a part of their empire building before the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. So the early church fathers were confronted with this basic dilemma. The teachings of the founder of Christianity seemed to be averse to any type of warfare, and yet they needed to incorporate warfare into their moral reasoning. So how did they do that? Well, they did that by basically reaching back into the ancient, especially Roman tradition of thinking on war. In the writings of the early church defenders of just war, we find Cicero being quoted far more often than Jesus Christ. Of course, they were very creative in trying to interpret certain verses, certain passages from the life of Jesus in a way that lent support to the idea that, in fact, Christians can employ warfare, they can employ violence. One of the most famous passages from the New Testament, which was quoted by these defenders of a Christian just war, was when Jesus entered the temple and found the temple having been overridden by money changers and merchants and all kinds of activity that was contrary to what the temple in Jerusalem was supposed to be for. And he rather violently overturned the tables of the money changers and drove them out of the temple. In one of the Gospels, he is supposed to have fashioned a whip and whipped the money changers as he drove them out of the temple. So it was these fleeting and very brief mentions of the possibility of the use of violence in the New Testament that the early Christian advocates for a just war latched onto. But by far, the more well-developed theory of just war they found in the natural law thinking, which had underwritten both Greek and Roman conceptions of a just war. Now, in the Jihad tradition, of course, begins to develop during the time of the Prophet Muhammad himself. In the first 13 or so years of the Prophet's life, we find that the term jihad in the Quran is not used with any real direct meaning having to do with war. There is absolutely no reference to warfare as a part of jihad in the entire Meccan revelation. It is only when we turn to the Medinan revelation of the Quran and when we see the Medinan part of the Prophet Muhammad's mission and preaching that we find that the term jihad, which of course all of you know does not mean warfare in its root. Jihad is a very broad concept and it means simply to struggle or to give one's utmost towards some cause, towards some goal. But in Medina, it is without doubt that one aspect of this struggle or this striving can be military. It can be struggling and striving in the path of God on the battlefield. So from the latter part of the Quranic revelation and the Prophet's life, later Muslim jurists, and when I say later, I mean roughly 150 or 200 years after the death of the Prophet, the Muslim scholars, Muslim jurists began to develop what is today the Jihad doctrine. The Jihad doctrine as it has come to be sort of seen as a part of Muslim conceptions of international relations and international law. And this jihad tradition came to be very well developed in the classical works on fiqh. So in terms of origins, just war tradition is much more ancient. Jihad tradition starts to develop roughly 200 or 300 years after the first writers on just war within Christianity. But I should mention one thing before I pause to let you ask another question, Rutaba, and that is that when the just war tradition became codified, that is when the first Christians really developed a full doctrine of just war, that is they wrote entire treatises on it. That didn't happen until the 11th century of the Common Era. So that means that by this point, some 200 or 300 years of jihad thinking had already taken place among Muslims. So by the 11th century, it was the jihad tradition in Muslim cultures and Islamic civilization that was the far more developed theory of legitimate warfare in the entire Western world. Just war thinking was catching up. And this is the interesting thing to speculate about. How much were the Christian thinkers on just war influenced by developments that had already taken place in Muslim lands on jihad thinking? So there are some vague hints that certainly they knew about jihad, but we'll never know the full extent of the influence because, of course, these great writers of the Middle Ages or medieval Christianity, and indeed in Islamic civilization, no one wrote footnotes when they were writing their treatises. They did not credit the sources of their ideas. So what we have are intriguing possibilities of the cross-fertilization of ideas among Muslims and Christians, and indeed among Jews as well, who were also residing in Christian and in Muslim lands.
Wow. Well, that is fascinating. I mean, to know the history of how these both traditions came about, and listening to you, they sound awfully similar in how they evolved and how they, well, kind of solidified over the years. And now I want to turn to something, broadly speaking, about the ethics surrounding the war. You know, what are the ethics surrounding the grounds for going to war and conduct in war? And how did the two legal traditions, because you talk about cross-fertilization, how did the two legal traditions influence one another? How similar, because you seem to think that there's compatibility between the two. How similar or dissimilar are the two in that regard as well?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question. So in terms of the moral reasoning that both traditions engage in, they divide questions of the legitimate grounds for war from questions of the legitimate means of war. In the just war tradition, these two moral considerations have a Latin designation, which is widely used, which is widely found in the literature. So it's convenient to use these terms. Jus ad bellum. What are the just causes or grounds for actually engaging in warfare? And jus in bello, what are the legitimate means once warfare has begun that soldiers, armies can employ? Now, what's important to understand is that in both just war and in jihad, jus ad bellum and jus in bello are considered morally independent of each other. That is, no matter how good your cause for going to war may be, no matter how just it may be, you must still abide by the restraints that are part of the jus in bello tradition, or the jus in bello side of the just war tradition. So just war cannot be total war. Just war can never be total war. And I'll break down the considerations on both jus ad bellum and jus in bello in a second. Similarly, in jihad, from the very earliest formulations of the jihad tradition, indeed, we can find the roots of these arguments within Quranic verses themselves. There is the same independence between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. No matter how good the grounds or causes for Muslims going to war, Muslim armies must still abide by the constraints that are part of the jus in bello part of the jihad tradition. They can never say, well, our cause is just, God ordained jihad for us, therefore we can employ any means necessary to achieve victory. That is not part of the jihad tradition. So this is a crucial similarity between both. Now we find further similarities as we break down both jus ad bellum and jus in bello. For example, in the just war tradition, parts of the jus ad bellum side of the equation include such things as, does the party have a just cause for going to war? Is there legitimate authority for declaring that the war is in fact just or lawful? Is the resort to warfare the last resort? Have other means short of warfare already been exhausted? And then there's a vague or somewhat slippery concept known as right intent. Are you fighting the warfare with the right purpose in mind? And the right purpose in mind is to address the initial grievance against you, to redress wrongs, not to seek vengeance, not to punish necessarily the other side. Now, in the jihad tradition, we find very similar criteria. Is there a just cause? Now here we have a slight difference, which is very important to mention. And Muslim theorists on jihad over the past 2 centuries have spent an enormous amount of time wrangling over just cause in jihad because of a very simple reason. When the classical theory was developed, beginning roughly in the late 8th century, early 9th century of the Common Era, the classical jurists spent most of their time talking about what we could call an expansionist or an offensive jihad, a jihad to expand the Islamic empire, to expand the realm of Darul Islam. Jihad was not intended, because it was not permitted by the Quran to be such. Jihad was not a war to convert unbelievers per se, not directly anyway. So in the minds of the classical jurists, the purpose of jihad, by and large, was to expand the frontiers of Darul Islam. Now, there was a second cause, which they did not spend much time writing about or discussing in their works, and that was, of course, self-defense, defensive war. The reason may be that they simply understood that defensive war was, of course, a right that Muslims had, and that it was a very important understanding of jihad. So the just cause of expansionist war, that clearly does not conform with the way just war has been understood by and large over the centuries within Christianity. And it certainly is not the understanding of just war in our contemporary international system. There is no room within the UN Charter, which is, of course, the ultimate expression of international law, and one could say the ultimate result of the evolution of just war thinking in Western societies. There is no room at all for a war of imperialism, for a war to expand one's political domain or hegemony beyond the borders that are recognized by the international community as being those of a legitimate state. So what has happened, of course, among Muslims is this aspect of the jus ad bellum of jihad has been subjected to tremendous discussion and indeed reinterpretation and reform. I think it's without doubt that the mainstream jihad tradition today has come to disavow this initial understanding by the classical jurists that one type of jihad could be expansionist war or offensive war. Today, most Muslim scholars are taking great pains to define the legitimate causes for jihad as being strictly self-defense. Self-defense when aggressors commit a violation of the territorial sovereignty of Muslim states, when Muslim peoples are being attacked, when their property is being expropriated unjustly. And there's sometimes there's a willingness to even talk about when the honor of Muslims is being violated, when Muslim dignities are being trampled upon. But clearly there is an attempt to now move the jus ad bellum of jihad more in line with just war thinking and with international law. Now, in terms of conduct, there is, from the very beginning, a great deal of similarity, because both just war and jihad have at the core of jus in bello 2 essential principles. One is the principle of discrimination. Muslim soldiers can only intentionally target those who are fighting them on the battlefield. And what this has largely meant, of course, is able-bodied males. males who are engaged in combat against Muslim forces. Women and children from the very beginning have been excluded as legitimate targets in jihad. And clearly we find the same kind of thinking in the just war tradition. Now, Rutaba, you asked me earlier about the possibilities of, mutual influences and possible diffusion of ideas. There is a debate on how this notion of discrimination came to be firmly enshrined within the just war tradition. Did it arise from purely European sources, or possibly was there an attempt to match Muslim writings on discrimination, especially that the Christians found in Spain? Spain was the area where Christianity and Islam perhaps most fruitfully exchanged ideas with each other during the entire period of the Reconquista, which went on for centuries, of course, in the Iberian Peninsula. So there's a lot of speculation. Again, there's no way to prove that Christians borrowed ideas of discrimination from Muslims or vice versa. But we do know that there are very similar traditions there. Women and children are not considered combatants, and therefore they should be protected or immune from direct harm. Some writers about the development of jus in bello suggest that these traditions developed from the chivalric traditions of Christian societies, chivalric traditions that had their roots in German or Northern European civilizations, not so much from the Southern contacts that Christians had with Muslims in Spain. We'll never know, and perhaps it's not even all that significant, because what is important is that the moral questions and the moral conclusions were very similar in both traditions. Now, finally, in addition to discrimination, there's one other consideration in both just war and jihad, and this is known as proportionality. Proportionality is not well defined in either tradition. It's deliberately vague and flexible. It essentially means that when you are engaged in hostilities, when your soldiers are in the field, only the amount of force that is necessary to achieve one's military objectives is permissible to use. Proportionality disavows escalating, for example, to the most destructive types of weapons. The idea is that you use the minimal force necessary to achieve your goals. And the check on proportionality clearly is the notion of discrimination. If you ever reach a point where your weapons are so indiscriminate that they are not capable of distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, then of course you have a problem. You need to reconsider the types of weapons that are being, or the tactics that are being used on the battlefield. So the criterion of proportionality has, of course, today been used in the debates among both Westerners and among Muslims on the legitimacy of weapons of mass destruction. In particular, can nuclear weapons ever be considered legitimate weapons in either tradition?
That is very, very interesting. I obviously want to move the conversation more from the history to more contemporary dialogues and discourses over here. We know that just war doctrine, like you said, evolved and adapted to changing religious, cultural, and political developments in the West. So it kind of picked up pace later in history. It culminated into international law, which operated in the global system comprised of nation states. How compatible is the doctrine of jihad to the contemporary world order? And the second part of the question is, what contributions have contemporary Muslim jurists made to advance this development of the doctrine of jihad?
Yes, excellent. So the international law that we find today at the center of our international system attempts to put our international system on a more rational legal foundation. That edifice began to develop in the late 19th century, the mid to late 19th century. And as it developed, primarily among Europeans, we find only sporadic contributions from Muslims. Muslim states were few in number, we have to remember, at that time. The Ottomans were vitally concerned with these developments because the Ottoman Empire was, in fact, a European empire. So the Ottomans were involved in most of the early conferences. And the early conferences they're basically two tracks which are cited by international lawyers as the source of international humanitarian law, IHL, as it's called today. One is the Geneva track, which has to do with the regulation of warfare when it applies especially to human beings, to prisoners of war, to non-combatants, to civilian populations in general. And the other track is the Hague track. Hague law deals much more with weapons of war and with permissible tactics and means of war rather than the victims of war. So in both tracks, the Ottoman Empire was involved. They had ambassadors, they had delegates, but the Ottoman Empire was not engaged in trying to develop international law or contribute to the development of international law as a Muslim empire. And by that I mean there's very little evidence that the Ottoman delegates injected any aspect of the Islamic thinking on jihad into the deliberations. They were operating, and of course at this point, international law was being developed as a secular body of law. There was really very little attempt by the Europeans to inject specifically Christian doctrine into the development of international law. So we had by and large secularists who were developing this international legal framework. And perhaps that's natural and to be expected because they were trying to develop a universal legal order. So what we find among Muslims is intellectual activity on the sidelines. As international law developed, we had a number of Muslim writers begin to comment on these international legal principles. So some of them took great pains to defend Islamic, what they consider to be a fully developed Islamic international legal system as the best system for Muslims to follow. And they criticized and challenged the development of international law as an alien legal code that Muslims should resist, because why should Muslims turn to anything but their own tradition for answers to issues as important as how to conduct international relations? So I've called this group of Muslim theoreticians the rejectionists. They are rejectionists in the sense that they believe that Muslims have no need to borrow or to embrace basically a European international legal system. And of course, we have to remember that this international legal system was being universalized in the wake of imperialism. So there was that resistance to embrace any part of European civilization because it was seen as being imposed on non-Western peoples by European imperialists. But by and large, I think the rejectionists among Muslims are the minority, because two other groups are clearly more influential, and we see their influence being reflected in the actual practice of Muslim states today. I've called these other two groups the assimilationists. They want to basically assimilate Muslims into the international legal system and argue that there's no issue whatsoever, that there's no real incompatibility between jihad, just war, or Muslim thinking on international relations in general and the development of international law. Another group I have called the accommodationists. And what the accommodationists do is try to find a middle ground between the assimilationists and the rejectionists. They argue that in fact, Muslims do have a distinct body of international law. And this body of international law is essentially compatible with international law, public international law, as it evolved in Europe and then became universalized in the international system as a whole. What the accommodationists are arguing, though, is that there are certain special requirements that Muslim states have vis-a-vis one another. In other words, and I'm speaking to the right audience here, because the Organization of Islamic Cooperation is the most significant manifestation of the accommodationist viewpoint. Muhammad Iqbal articulated this vision, as did Abdurrazak Sanhuri, a great Egyptian jurist, when they both envisaged that Muslim states, once they became independent, once they became free of European colonial rule, they would naturally associate with one another in what Iqbal called a Muslim League of Nations, a Muslim League of Nations. So basically, the accommodationist position boils down to the idea that there's nothing fundamentally incompatible between Islamic law and international law, that Muslim states can be good members of the universal international society, but that does not absolve them of special obligations they have with one another. There is, in the minds of the accommodationists, a moral imperative that emerges out of the Ummah concept, which is, of course, central to all Islamic ethics. So what are these special obligations? There are a number of them. The first and foremost is that the Muslim world should keep its own house in order. There is no reason whatsoever for outsiders to be involved in conflict resolution among Muslims. This was an enormous controversy during the Gulf War of 1990-91. Why did the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia invite Western troops into the kingdom to deal with what was essentially an intra-Muslim dispute? The second issue, I think, that has been prominent in accommodationist thinking has to do with distributive justice. Muslim peoples have an obligation, according to their faith, as a pillar of their faith, to make sure that there are not vast discrepancies in income distribution among Muslims. There is, according to the accommodationist way of thinking, there's no excuse whatsoever that some Muslim peoples are struggling just to survive, to avoid famine or chronic malnutrition, or suffer from the ravages of pandemics, whereas other Muslims are living in what can only be described as the apex of the luxurious lifestyle. So distributive justice concerns are also very much part of the accommodationist argument that there is and ought to be a Muslim international society within as a subset of the broader international society.
Wow, that is so interesting. I mean, we could have a different conversation altogether based on the criteria categorization that you've developed. Just out of curiosity, where do you place yourself in those three categories?
Well, as I said earlier, I think that the rejectionists are a rather fringe group among these Muslim intellectuals who think seriously about contemporary international law. And what's very interesting is that some of these rejectionists end up becoming statesmen. For example, when they were in the opposition, well, let me put it this way. When Ayatollah Khomeini was a revolutionary leader, he seemed to be very much a Muslim cosmopolitan. That is, he argued for the Ummah paradigm as being the only legitimate Islamic approach to international relations. But when Ayatollah Khomeini became the head of state of the Islamic Republic of Iran, we find that he was willing to make some concessions. He was willing to compromise on his cosmopolitanism. I don't think that Ayatollah Khomeini ever backed away from the Ummah paradigm as the ideal. But as a statesman or as a politician, Khomeini and his supporters in the Islamic Republic realized that they had to react to the environment in which they were operating. And so they made concessions. Some of Khomeini's later speeches, they actually sound very much like Iranian nationalist rhetoric or Iranian nationalism, which of course Khomeini had castigated when he was trying to overthrow the Shah. Similarly, in Pakistan, Maulana Maududi, he is one of the most creative thinkers in the rejectionist camp. Maududi wrote his first major work, in fact, was a book on jihad, Al-Jihad fil Islam, which was, despite the title, it was a book written in Urdu. It's only recently been fully translated into English. At the end of Al-Jihad fil Islam, Maulana Maududi spends a great deal of time going through the development of public international law. And he ends up concluding that public international law has nothing to offer the Muslims. And I mean literally nothing to offer the Muslims. Islam has answers to all questions, including questions of international relations, and the Islamic laws of war and peace were fully developed well before Westerners began to even think about these issues, according to the Maulana. And so he ends up basically speculating, why would any Muslim of sound mind and body, why would any Muslim embrace this foreign, sort of import into the Muslim world? We have all the answers we need within Islam itself. Now, what's interesting though is the Jamaat-e-Islami never challenged Pakistan's membership in the United Nations. And the Jamaat-e-Islami was very much at pains to defend various treaties that they believed were in Pakistan's national interests. So whenever the Kashmir dispute comes up, for example, the Jamaat-e-Islami is fully on board, at least in Pakistan, with the Pakistani government's position regarding the Kashmir dispute. So what I'm trying to say is the Jamaat-e-Islami and Maulana Maududi, just as Ayatollah Khomeini did in Iran, they were willing to qualify their ideal rejectionism in the name of pragmatism, in the name of practical necessities. So the rejectionists, I don't think have established a large following, quite honestly. Most Muslim scholars today are either assimilationists or they're accommodationists. Personally, I feel that there is absolutely nothing incompatible between Islamic teachings on international law and the way public international law has developed. If anything, I would consider myself to be an accommodationist, a follower in the line of Muhammad Iqbal, to argue that indeed there is something that is particular to Muslim relations with other Muslims. And that those responsibilities are not captured by the current state of international law, which has at its core, it has the idea of state sovereignty. Sovereignty can be used to basically draw up the drawbridge, that states have connecting them with other states, and say, we are completely immune. We have no reason to worry about what's happening around us. This line of thinking we have seen, of course, very prominent in recent years in the United States of America. A resurfacing of the most crass type of isolationism and extreme nationalism. Personally, I believe nationalism is one of the greatest sources of human misery on the planet today, and that it is not, in its most extreme interpretations, it is not compatible with Islamic teachings on the universality of the Muslim community, of the Ummah.
Fascinating, very interesting. I do want to pick up on something you said earlier about imperialism and Western intervention kind of creating the friction between the Western and the Eastern world. So how did this advent of colonialism and recent Western interventions in Muslim majority countries impact the discourse surrounding jihad?
Yeah. Yes, very good question. Well, imperialism, of course, created a need for Muslims to place defensive jihad at the center of their thinking about jus ad bellum. So you remember when I discussed the classical tradition, what's remarkable is that even during the Crusades, when the Muslims were facing an onslaught from the European Crusaders, there wasn't really an upsurge in emphasis on the defensive aspects of jihad. at least not explicitly. There was an upsurge in jihad thinking. There were more writers, and they were very creative in their writings on jihad, because writing on jihad had kind of settled down and lapsed by that point. But of course, the Crusades created a need to rethink the importance of jihad within Islamic tradition. So similarly, the expansion of European imperialism, and in some parts of the world, European colonialism, that led to a resurfacing of jihad thinking. So there's, without doubt, there's a direct correlation, because we find the most important rethinking or reinterpretation of jihad really happening in the past 2 centuries. There's a direct correlation from the time of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 to the present, when we find an upsurge in not only writing and thinking and discussing about what jihad means for contemporary Muslims, but also in the use of jihad, claims to jihad in practical politics. So the reaction among Muslims was initially rather defensive. And by that, I mean to try to defend jihad against charges by Westerners that jihad was essentially offensive warfare and that Islam had been spread by the sword. So there was a great deal, of course, of polemics. The missionaries who came into Muslim countries brought with them Orientalist literature that discussed openly the use of force to convert non-Muslims to Islam. And indeed, there was an upsurge in writing among local populations, non-Muslim local populations. For example, Maulana Maududi composed Al-Jihad fil Islam in opposition to a Hindu writer's attacks on jihad, not Western writers. So there was a defensiveness. And this defensiveness essentially meant redefining the jus ad bellum of jihad in a way so that jihad could only be understood as defensive warfare. The famous writer in India, Chirag Ali, wrote an entire treatise in which he purported to prove that the Prophet never waged any kind of offensive warfare, that all the battles of the Prophet had been purely defensive in their nature, and that there was not a single verse of the Quran that could be used to justify offensive warfare. Well, that kind of defensiveness naturally over time led to a reaction. And that reaction came from Muslim intellectuals who said that these writers are being apologetic in their attempt to strip jihad of any military component. The defensiveness sometimes took an extreme form in arguing that, in fact, jihad could only be understood as spiritual struggle, that it never meant warfare. Well, clearly that's a disingenuous line of thinking, because the classical Muslim writers themselves, the greatest minds of the classical age of Islam, when they wrote about jihad, they wrote about warfare. In their Kitabul Jihad, they were not discussing spiritual struggle, they were discussing struggle on the battlefield. They were describing legitimate warfare. So the reaction that occurred was in some ways an attempt to recapture the classical meaning of jihad as both struggle writ large, but also struggle in a military sense. And so we find this reaction to the early apologetic literature taking multiple forms. We find some Muslim writers arguing that jihad today can only be understood as defensive warfare, can only be understood as self-defense. And in that way, they are trying to align the jihad tradition with contemporary international law, which of course, as we discussed earlier, essentially outlaws any type of aggressive warfare. Other Muslim writers, of course, doesn't need too much discussion. Other Muslim writers are not willing to go that far. They're not willing to make that concession. they argue that, in fact, jihad meant both defensive as well as offensive warfare. Now, when they write about offensive warfare, what they're basically arguing, because they are intellectuals and they are engaged in discussions with their fellow intellectuals, so they are not simpletons. They're not making simplistic arguments. They're trying to accommodate the notion of offensive warfare to modern times. So the way they define offensive warfare often is by saying that if the right to propagate religion is being blocked by others, then Muslims have a right to open the land to the peaceful propagation of Islam. In other words, jihad can be used to liberate the land to allow for the peaceful preaching of Islam, and people are free to accept it or not accept it. So you see what's happening here. This line of thinking basically is going back to the classical understanding of offensive warfare, because the offensive nature of jihad in the classical Islamic literature was basically in line with liberating lands, opening lands. And that's why we use the term futuhat. Futuhat, the initial Islamic conquests, were to literally open the land to the peaceful propagation of religion. And that's what this strand of jihad interpreters today, they're trying to recapture. They're trying to say that this is a right that human beings have. In this sense, of course, they are very much out of sync with international law, which has no such right granted to religious proselytizers within it. And what they're doing is basically pursuing a line of thinking that was present not just in Islamic thinking on jihad, but also we can find similarities in Christian writings, early Christian writings in the 1500s, 1600s on legitimate just war. So this is a very messy answer to your question for a very simple reason. Contemporary Muslim discourses on jihad are quite messy. They range the spectrum, but I would say that if we are to try to distill this discourse into a consensus, again, the consensus very much would be that jihad is not in any way incompatible with the current international understandings of international law and indeed with the international system as a whole.
Interesting. So I'm going to ask my last question of today, because I know that we're running short of time, but it's very important because there's one more group that has a significant impact on at least a projection of jihad to the world, right? And this is the militant organizations such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda that propagate the idea of jihad as an offensive, unrestrained war targeting Muslims and non-Muslim civilians alike. How is this notion of jihad different from what classical jurists had in mind? And if you can very quickly shed light on how contemporary Muslim jurists or scholars have responded to this militant stream of ideas about jihad.
Yes, thank you. Important question. First, with regard to jus ad bellum, I need to go into a little bit of detail here because there is a great deal, I think, of misunderstanding, both in the West and even among Muslims. Now, the militant organizations, they are often seen as going back to the classical notion of offensive jihad. That is, jihad is meant to reduce the territory of non-believers, Darul Harb, and expand the territory of believers, Darul Islam. However, that is not the case. If one looks carefully at their justifications for their warfare, for their jihad, one finds very little discussion at all about expanding the territory of Muslims. One finds very little references to Darul Harb for a very simple reason. The organizations, the militants that we see operating today, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and their various sort of supporters and fellow groups around the world, they are overwhelmingly concerned, first and foremost, with converting their own lands into proper Islamic states. In other words, I'll try to be as direct as I can. Their discourses are not engaged or focused on offensive jihad, but rather on defensive jihad. They see themselves as responding to the aggression of the states that they are trying to take over, the governments that they're trying to overthrow. They argue that these governments have declared war on Islam and against true Muslims. So their first and foremost goal is to overthrow these only nominally Muslim rulers and Muslim governments. It is very much in line with classical defensive jihad discourses, as scanty as they were. Now, what we have to remember, though, is that in the classical Islamic tradition, there was very little scope for rebellion against the Muslim state. Very little. And this is, of course, the same in pretty much all political theory. There's hardly any political theory which opens a wide door to rebellion. That would be rather counterproductive, because political theory is trying to establish stability, not disorder or anarchy. So what these contemporary groups have tried to do is to argue that, in fact, they're not dealing with Muslims at all. They're not the rebels. They are the true Muslims who are defending themselves against apostates, against kafir. Some of them use very much that term, against the kuffar. So what they have done, as you have heard this term, they have employed the notion of takfir, excommunication of fellow Muslims, as a way to justify their armed action. Now, of course, down the road in this militant worldview, there is the idea of resuming the offensive jihad against Darul Harb. But that phase of their jihad is very, very far in the future. There is almost no concerted discussion of that particular aspect of jihad in their discourses. Overwhelmingly, they are defending the use of force to overthrow what they consider to be false governments and basically apostate regimes. Now, in terms of the use in bello, they, in their use of total warfare, they have been widely condemned by Muslim scholars worldwide. The actions of ISIS most recently elicited a tremendous response from ulama around the world, as did earlier Al-Qaeda's attacks around the world, and especially the 9/11 attack on the United States. So in short, the use of terrorism as a tactic of jus in bello has been widely condemned. Because you remember, we don't need to wrangle too much about this. From the very beginning of the jihad tradition, the notion of discrimination was at its core. We have numerous hadith which establish the principle of discrimination. The principle of discrimination is discussed widely in the classical works on fiqh. And at the root of the principle of discrimination is that only those who are fighting you, only combatants are legitimate targets of military action. The idea that the entire population is somehow culpable for the wrongs of their government, that is contrary to the jihad tradition. So in other words, what the militants have done is to conflate jus ad bellum with jus in bello. They have gotten rid of that independence thesis, which is at the core of just war and jihad thinking. In their minds, because their goals are so worthy, because jihad is being waged for such lofty purposes, any and all means may be used to pursue it. Well, that is essentially contradictory with the vast, broad, mainstream thinking on jihad over the past 1400 years.
Wow, that was incredibly, incredibly insightful. I don't know how we got in so much information out of you in just under 1 hour or a little over 1 hour. But I feel, I mean, coming out of the conversation, I feel much more educated about something that we were born with the idea that we already know, but we don't actually know so much about. So thank you so much, Dr. Hashmi, for that conversation, for just packing all of your decades worth of work and just enlightening all of us who are present here. With that, I think that we've had a very disciplined audience who have been very eager in wanting to ask their questions. So I think the time is right, Mehelka, to open the floor for questions that are coming in from the audience member. What do you think?
I think that's excellent. And Rutaba and Dr. Sohail Hashmi, both thank you so much for a very, very insightful discussion. You've actually generated a lot more questions, and they're coming in all the way from Pakistan and China and around the US as well. So we're going to get right to them. And I think, Dr. Hashmi, you might have already touched upon this a little bit, but we have somebody from Pakistan, Tariq Ijaz, who asks you to elaborate the concept of Darul Harb and Darul Islam and whether that's applicable in today's context.
Thank you, Tariq. That's a very good question. I'll begin by saying that neither concept was well developed, even by the greatest of the classical jurists. The categories are mentioned, but they're often mentioned only in passing. So what we have basically is a literature that is very undeveloped in giving us a full definition or full understanding of how the classical jurists understood these terms. What we do find is some basic principles, an outline of a definition. Darul Islam is the land where Muslims are not necessarily the majority of the population. That's very important to understand. Muslims are not necessarily in any part of Darul Islam, necessarily the majority of the population. The fundamental aspect of Darul Islam is that this is the territory where Islamic law is supreme, where Sharia is applied as the sovereign law of the land. So again, you remember what I said earlier about the classical notion of the expansionist jihad or the offensive jihad. That may be redefined as an imperialist jihad. The idea behind this understanding of Darul Islam is that Muslim armies would expand the territory in which Islamic law was applied. And then once non-Muslims had lived under the benefits of this divine law, of this Islamic law, they would of their own accord realize the merits of Islam, the religion, and they would of their own accord, of their own free will, convert to Islam. So we know, for example, in the history of the early Islamic conquests, that areas such as Mesopotamia and Egypt, they remained primarily non-Muslim for centuries. Muslim populations were the minority in these areas. But what characterized these areas as part of Darul Islam is that in these areas, Muslims formed the government and Sharia was the sovereign law. Of course, you all know that non-Muslims were assimilated into Darul Islam as dhimmis. And as dhimmis, they could have their own legal codes for their own communities, for their own, they could have their own religious law, for example. They could structure their own family courts according to this religious law. They could have their own leaders. But what they could not do was claim that their own law was the sovereign law of the land, because the sovereign law of the land in Darul Islam is Islamic law. Now, Darul Harb gets even less treatment among the classical jurists. What they do basically with Darul Harb is to make it a mirror of Darul Islam. So simply put, Darul Harb is any territory where the Sharia is not sovereign, where Islamic law does not reign supreme. And in this area, the assumption is that the people living in it do not enjoy the full benefits of God's revelation to mankind. They are in a way, benighted peoples. They are living in less than ideal circumstances. And the idea is that there is always the possibility of corruption and anarchy, which would be best removed by incorporating these areas into Darul Islam. Now, we have to remember that Darul Islam can expand both peacefully and through jihad, through militant jihad. Darul Islam could expand when Darul Harb decides that it wants to convert, or parts of Darul Harb decide that they want to convert and become Muslim. They would be peacefully assimilated into Darul Islam. Finally, there's a third category, which in particular the Shafi'i school developed in some detail, and that is the category of Darul Sulh. We have to remember that as well. It's not just Darul Harb and Darul Islam. There is also Darul Sulh. Darul Sulh is the area with which the Islamic State has either a truce or a treaty that is more long-term, which allows Darul Sulh to remain independent under non-Islamic law, but with a guarantee of security or peace from the Muslim state. So these are the three broad terms that are used most frequently. There are many others as well, but these are the three that occur quite often in the classical literature.
The next question is actually from Humayun Khan. He asked why rejectionists didn't have mass followers in majority Muslim states.
Humayun, thank you. That's an interesting question. I think for one simple reason, that the rejectionists themselves did not formulate their rejectionism into policy. They wrote about it in their treatises, they spoke about it in their speeches, and indeed they tried to implement it. You know, I mentioned Ayatollah Khomeini compromised, and he sounded, especially in his latter years, he sounded more and more like an Iranian nationalist. But we have to remember that he was in many ways forced into this position. He was forced from his earlier Islamic cosmopolitanism because of the stark realities in which he was operating. And of course, the most important reality was the Iran-Iraq war, which dominated pretty much all of Khomeini's years as the leader of the Islamic Republic. So the Iran-Iraq war created a situation where Ayatollah Khomeini had to rally his people, and he and his supporters rallied their people to respond to the Iraqi aggression against Iran by talking about the Iranian nation. So again, I would say that Khomeini never backed away from the ideal. And you have to also remember that the constitution of the Islamic Republic actually has cosmopolitan ideals built within it. It calls for the Islamic Republic to see as one of its duties the propagation or the spread of an Islamic community of nations, that is the recreation of the Ummah. That aspiration is built into the constitution of the Islamic Republic itself. But when you were fighting a war, and especially in the early period when Iran was reeling from that attack, then you draw upon whatever means are necessary to defend your people and defend your nation. And so that's, I think, what Ayatollah Khomeini did.
Great, thank you, Sohail. We have another question from Ruslan, who is doing research on Islam and Muslims in China and is now working at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And his question is, I was wondering what has changed in jihad in modern Islamic militancy, and likewise, to what extent is the recent global war on terror different from the just war doctrine?
Rostam, thank you. I'm trying to grasp what your intent is behind, especially the second part, the global war on terror. Do you have something in mind, Rostam, in particular with regard to that? Do you believe that the global war on terror is a violation of just war doctrine? Is there any way to talk
Ruslan,
about
if you'd like to unmute yourself, yes, and please just
may I?
yes, please go ahead.
please? Yeah.
Hold on, I'm trying to sit more to the light because it's at night here in Hong Kong. Thank you so much, first of all, for the wonderful talk. That was really insightful. I was just kind of thinking, I guess, in binary terms, insofar as Islamic militancy today assumes to be a paradigmatic example of what jihad in Islam is or what it should be, right? I was trying to understand what then changes in the classical doctrine of jihad once we think about Islamic militancy. And then likewise then, insofar as we tend to think about the global war on terror as a modern way of waging war, right? So we had kind of a, Schmittian accounts of European war, and then we have this Cold War, and then the most recent example is the global war on terror. So there is also a change in the way the West rethinks the concept of the war itself, right? From territory based, now it becomes global. So I was thinking, what new changes does that then mindset introduces to the idea of just war when the war, presumably just in this case against terrorism, becomes global?
Very good. Yes, no, I understand a little bit more the thrust of your question. So first of all, with regard to the militants' redefinition of jihad, they are trying to return, as you use the word paradigmatic, they're trying to return to the paradigmatic classical arguments with regard to perhaps use ad bellum. And even there, though, as I mentioned, they are not fully paradigmatic in the classical framework because they are not concerned with offensive warfare, offensive jihad. They are overwhelmingly obsessed with defensive warfare. Now, this comes as a shock whenever I have this conversation with American audiences in particular. They say, well, what about Al-Qaeda? Al-Qaeda attacked the United States of America. How much more offensive can you get than that? But, when 9/11 happened, I myself was shocked, and I rushed to try to figure out what was the justification for that attack, because it seemed to violate everything that the militants had been focused on up to that point, which was that we fight the near enemy. We fight our local corrupt, nominally Muslim leaders, and then we worry about the West only later on. Now, this is a redefinition of jihad among militants, but it's not a fundamental change, because what I discovered is that bin Laden, who was the primary advocate for attacking the United States, it's become clear now in studies of Al-Qaeda's ideological evolution, that Osama bin Laden himself pushed very heavily for this attack on the United States. It was not, however, defended as a resurrection of the notion of offensive jihad or expansionist jihad. It was simply a change in tactics. The strategy still remained to, first of all, convert local Muslim lands into true Islamic states. And then only after that jihad was finished, then only after that would they worry about Darul Harb. But what bin Laden emphasized is there was no way to fight the near enemy unless the far enemy could be pushed out of Muslim lands. So in attacking the United States, bin Laden was not arguing that he was opening a new front in the jihad to, or changing the focus of the jihad to now start a campaign to convert, for example, the United States into Darul Islam. That was never part of his agenda. He never actually mentioned anything about that. He had no interest at all in converting any American to Islam. What he thought would happen is that by striking a blow against the United States, the American government, spurred on by the American people, would decide that it wasn't worth it for them to keep the Saudi regime propped up in Saudi Arabia. What bin Laden hoped was that that strike on 9/11 would drive the United States out of Muslim countries, especially the countries of the Gulf. And then, of course, Al-Qaeda would be free to continue its defensive jihad against the near enemy and overthrow the Saudi rulers. And if you look at ISIS's discourses on jihad, they are very much the same. They're very much the same. So initially, when ISIS rose to power, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff himself did a very, I think, perceptive analysis of ISIS's goals, and he concluded that ISIS was not a threat to the United States of America, at least not to the American homeland. ISIS posed a threat to American interests in the Middle East. Of course, we know that President Obama decided that that threat to American interests, especially the American propped regime in Iraq, required an American military intervention. But what I'm trying to say is that the militant discourses on jihad, they are in fact quite conservative. They are not radical at all. They're very conservative. They're operating within, and Ruslan, I think you used the right word. They're trying to operate within the paradigmatic framework of the classical theory. Now, let me turn to your very important question about the global war on terror. Because yes, among just war theorists and among international lawyers, there is, of course, a great deal of discussion today about how the rise of non-state actors as major threats on the international stage, how that is fundamentally reshaping just war thinking. So we are no longer dealing with aggression across territorial frontiers committed by the armies of one state against another. These non-state actors do pose significant challenges to the development of just war thinking. They're not a state that can be attacked and repulsed. They require creative ways of containment. They require also creative ways in fighting them, because as irregular armies, there is really no target to attack. They're not massed on the battlefield or anything like that. So this has opened a whole Pandora's box of controversy in just war circles, because as you all know, this raises the question of the compatibility of drone warfare with just war arguments about discrimination. And drone warfare does open up serious considerations of discrimination, because on the one hand, there are proponents who say drone warfare, smart technology has made it possible to actually fight in a more discriminate way. That is, that this technology has opened the door for full compliance or even greater compliance with the principles of just war. But the way drone warfare has been often employed is contrary to the notion of discrimination, because often there are tactics that are used which do lead to vast collateral damage. So drone warfare may not necessarily explode the just war criterion of discrimination, but it certainly challenges it if it is not properly applied. And so I'm sure this is going to be a topic of continued discussion and refining of the rules of warfare as we proceed. Now, the issue that I think we need to take very seriously is the use of weapons of mass destruction on the part of the terrorists. Because, as I've discussed earlier, terrorism operates according to its own particular moral logic. That logic is total war. So if a weapon of mass destruction were to get in the hands of terrorists, I think we could expect a use of this weapon. We've already seen hints of this. We've seen Al-Qaeda trying to get its hands on biological and chemical weapons. The prospect of a terrorist organization getting its hand on a nuclear device is extremely concerning. So all of these issues are at the cutting edge of just war thinking today. Some thinking is proactive because the violations of just war are being committed by countries that purport to defend it, and others are reactive as a way to prevent possibly unscrupulous actors from getting their hands on weapons that would only give them, much stronger means to employ their terrorism. So quite a bit of need for continued thinking and refining of the traditions.
Thank you, Dr. Hashmi. And I know that we do have other questions around weapons of mass destruction, because we do know of that one country that has used it, previously. And I think Rutaba is going to turn to those questions just a little bit later. I did want to just quickly acknowledge that we have with us a very eminent scholar and personality, Dr. John L. Esposito, who is joining us as well. And so we would love for him at any point to just jump in and also, sort of share his insights about the topic, if at all he would be comfortable doing so. We'd like to give you the floor right now, Dr. Esposito, or later, just as you would prefer. Oh, and you're on mute. Okay, so I think, I think you might say something a little bit later. So Rutaba, why don't you go ahead with the next one?
Mehlaqa, could I, I'm sorry to interject, but could I say that I was just beginning my dissertation on Islamic thinking on jihad when I heard Professor Esposito speak on the ethics of the Gulf War. And that talk was so stimulating, so insightful, that I knew I was on the right track. So I continue to devote my future work to this topic, and it's really an honor to have you, Professor Esposito, with us. So please do jump in at any point that you would like to.
Oh, and you're, and we can't hear you, Dr. Esposito. I know you're unmuted, but we can't seem to hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. When you mentioned that many of the people on here were not, probably not alive when Sohail, moved up. Well, all I could think of was most of your parents weren't alive when I got into the field. So it was a little depressing thinking about that, but anyway.
I don't think it's quite that bad, but.
Well, we're very glad that you could join us. Thank you so much. And I also want to just point out, Namra Khan has been very patient from Pakistan with her question. And Namra, we are going to turn to you. In fact, a little bit later, we're going to ask you to unmute and sort of clarify your question. And so we're just waiting for a couple of other questions, and then we are going to get to you. So Rutaba, please go ahead.
Yeah, so the next two questions are quite similar, so I'm just going to group them together. They're from Zainab Amjad and Jen Taylor from Northeastern US. First of all, thank you for the insightful conversations. Zainab also said that she's been intrigued by the rich literature on the topic. And the questions pertain to contemporary times. Zainab says, we see a concerning trend of use of weapons of mass destruction and AI, artificial intelligence, that cannot be discriminated between combatants and non-combatants. How can this body of literature be leveraged better to prevent unjust wars through weapons of mass destruction? In the same vein, Jen Taylor wants to ask, do you think that just war is even possible in the age where assault rifles and other weapons intended to kill dozens of people at once are so readily available worldwide?
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. I'm again trying to understand the first one in particular. Are you in particular referring to nuclear weapons, biological, chemical weapons, or smart weapons in general? So let me, it may be difficult to get a response, but let me say that drone warfare, as I mentioned earlier, has the potential to limit civilian casualties. Weapons are only as discriminating as the people who use them. So if drone warfare, for example, is used in a way that it's carefully following a particular target, and there's a great deal of attempt made to make sure that the target is indeed a military target, then drone warfare has the potential to be limiting in terms of collateral damage. On the other hand, if drone warfare is used, first of all, as sometimes is done, to attack a target and then to follow up with a secondary attack against the people who rush to help the injured or the dying in the first attack, then of course there's a great deal of potential for collateral damage, for the killing of civilians who could be aid workers, for example. Now, the issue with regard to discrimination, I think, is much more clear-cut when we turn to NBC weapons. First of all, nuclear weapons are in a special category because they are by far the most destructive weapons that the human mind has devised to date. There's been talk endlessly about a rather low yield nuclear weapon that could be used as a battlefield weapon, a tactical nuke. But at this point, that still remains speculation. Because we have to remember one thing, nuclear weapons not only kill the immediate targets, but they also produce radioactive fallout. And that fallout can spread because of winds far from the battlefield. So even if a tactical nuke were to be employed in a very limited way, let's say in an isolated part of the battlefield, far from a civilian population center, or indeed against a ship on the open water, the prospect for harming non-combatants far from the battlefield will always be there because of the dangers of radioactive fallout. Similarly, many chemical agents produce lasting cross-generational damages. There is a warning on the American website of the Department of Veteran Affairs that talks about the continuing harm done to Vietnam War veterans from the use of Agent Orange in the jungles of Vietnam. These sort of chemical effects are still being felt by the veterans, and they're being passed on to their offspring of these veterans through genetic mutations. And of course, the same thing is true with biological weapons. So NBC weapons are not only weapons of indiscriminate warfare, because they make it impossible to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. They are weapons of lasting destruction, cross-generational destruction. How in the world is it possible to defend in either just war thinking or jihad tradition or jihad thinking the passing on of the effects of the use of these weapons to a fetus, to a child that was not even conceived when the weapons were first used? So I have argued very strongly that Muslims should categorically reject any attempt to incorporate weapons of mass destruction into jihad thinking, that they should be categorically rejected as completely illegitimate weapons, and that in fact Muslim countries should not be playing the proliferation game, because the proliferation game has very few benefits and the prospects of extremely grave consequences, if not catastrophe, should just one use of this weapon, these types of weapons, ever occur. So I'll stop there. I think there was a second question, Rutaba, about just war. Could you please rephrase that?
Yes, let me fetch it very quickly. The question was pretty similar to what Zainab asked. He was asking if you think that just war is even possible in an age where assault rifles or other weapons intended to kill a dozen people at the same time is even, is even possible. Do you think just war is a concept that will become obsolete now?
Well, unfortunately, as long as human beings are human beings, I think there's going to be a need for just war thinking. It's very hard to imagine our species evolving to an enlightened stage where we do not have recourse to violence. Are any of you on the screen pacifists? Are any of you prepared to justify a pacifist position, especially within an Islamic framework? I'm just curious. I mean, certainly I am not condemning pacifism, and in no way am I belittling its moral force. But what I'm trying to ask is, can you envision a human species that is at a point where there is no need to have recourse to violence in defense of oneself or in defense of one's family or one's nation. As long as there are aggressors who are willing to commit violence, there are going to be people who are going to defend the use of violence in response. So I think just war thinking it's hard to imagine just war thinking will disappear. And it's very hard to imagine that jihad will be stripped of its military component. So having said that, assault weapons and any type of weapon, they can be used indiscriminately or they can be used discriminately. The weapon itself does not pose a threat to just war or jihad, except perhaps for nuclear weapons. There's absolutely no way in my mind to imagine a nuclear weapon or a biological weapon. And most chemical weapons can be incorporated or assimilated into either just war or jihad thinking. But other types of weapons, for example, some people have argued that anti-personnel landmines pose a fundamental threat to the notion of discrimination. Anti-personnel landmines have the potential to kill innocents well after the conflict during which they were deployed has passed. But it is technologically possible to devise landmines that de-trigger themselves after a certain period of time. So technology is there, and weapons can be certainly made and used in a discriminate way. So I don't personally see the problem with the types of weapons that you have mentioned as being a fundamental threat to just war or to jihad.
Okay, thank you, Sohail. Namra Khan from Pakistan has been very, very patient. And what I'm going to do is ask her to unmute herself and just say out her question to you directly. So,
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, thank you so much for this amazing session. It was really worth it. It's my first time. Well, my question is that in international relations, we have studied that there are two types of powers. One is soft power and one is hard power. So soft power is where we lead with leadership. We don't need any military or any arms, any weapons. And the hard power is where we go for war by the help of the military and arms and ammunitions, all those stuff. So I wanted to ask that that we have to maintain both the powers when we go for the war. And but how, that's what we have studied, that in order to go for the war you have to maintain both soft power and hard power as well. So how about when we go for the war in just in bellow, so how can we maintain both powers at the same time?
Excellent question, Namra. Thank you very much for that. It gives me an opportunity to shift the discussion of jihad into its other aspect, which we haven't focused on today, but of course, which is central to the notion of jihad. What you've asked, Namra, is basically the essence of jihad. Jihad is both the use of soft power as well as hard power. We have to remember again what I said, for the majority of the Prophet's mission as a prophet, he understood jihad in line with Quranic revelations as essentially non-violent direct action. Non-violent direct action. There is absolutely no instance in the biography of the Prophet when he was in Mecca of him using violence of any sort, even as the persecution and the threats against him and his followers escalated from the Quraysh. So tragically, I think what Muslim interpreters of jihad, what they have tragically failed to take full advantage of is the soft power or the non-violent aspect, the diplomacy aspect of jihad, as well as the military, militant aspect of jihad. There's been, again, because of the classical emphasis on jihad as being armed struggle on the battlefield, as a result of their interpretations of the Prophet's activities in Medina, as opposed to his activities in Mecca, there's been too much emphasis on jihad as basically a violent response. We have to remember that when the Prophet was leading the community in Medina, he routinely employed diplomacy. He routinely employed nonviolent action. He was constantly trying to find a non-violent way to resolve the conflict that he and the Muslim community were engaged in with their enemies. So this fits in very well with the criterion of last resort. Armed reaction or armed action should be seen only as a last resort when other means have been exhausted. And there are many, many means that are available in the Muslims' diplomatic toolkit. So Muslims, you all, as you prepare for your careers in public service, inshallah, you should be very mindful of the full range of the meaning of jihad and the full, tools that are available to you as you wage jihad. It doesn't have to be using the sword or assault rifles or anything else. It could be using the diplomatic skills that you are developing now. So thank you for your question, Namra. I hope I've touched upon some points that you had in mind. If there's something specific, then please come back in and let us all know.
Well, we have a question from Facebook. It sounds more like a statement, but I think the person's trying to get your response to it. It says that Taliban in Afghanistan have been considered al-Baghi or rebel under Islamic law. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so the Taliban have not been the focus, to my knowledge, of the literature on Bugha. It's been primarily groups such as Tanzimul Jihad, the group that assassinated Anwar Sadat in Egypt. It's groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, which have been non-state actors. So the key thing I think we need to take away from the literature on Baghi or Ahl Bugha in the classical sources is that the classical scholars did not necessarily focus on jus ad bellum, but rather on jus in bello. They were willing to give a great deal of leeway to groups that considered themselves to be, if you will, innovative or dissident thinkers within the tradition. In other words, the classical scholars were willing to concede that there are many different interpretations of Islam. And that dissidents, if they express their dissidence in nonviolent ways, they did not necessarily become enemies because they were, after all, fellow Muslims. So the classical jurists focused on jus in bello. And here we find a great deal of leniency that the classical scholars gave to Ahl Bugha. The goal of fighting Ahl Bugha was not to kill or exterminate them, it was to find the swiftest means to rehabilitate them into the body politic of the Muslim community. So for example, if the rebel fighters were fleeing from the battlefield, they could not be chased down and slaughtered. Their property could not be seized and redistributed to other Muslims. And their women and children could never be enslaved, which of course was an option that was given to Muslim fighters for non-Muslim combatants. So again, I think the thrust of the classical theory we have to keep in mind. It is to remember that disputes among Muslims should be resolved as much as possible non-violently. There should always be room for negotiation, for discussion. If those talks, if those non-violent avenues prove unfruitful, then the Islamic State has the option to pursue violent means, but never with the goal of exterminating or outrightly destroying their fellow Muslims. the goal would always be to try to rehabilitate them as quickly as possible into the body politic. So if the Taliban or any group is willing to negotiate in good faith, then Muslims must be prepared to respond. If, on the other hand, they are undertaking to pursue their jihad by means that violate notions of discrimination and proportionality, then, of course, the Islamic State, the Muslim country, whatever the entity is that we're dealing with, they have the possibility of responding, but never in kind, never in kind. The actions of your enemies do not dictate what you as a Muslim state or as a Muslim army can do to combat them. You have to follow the principles of jihad.
So here, a very related question from Hidayatullah from Pakistan is, how do you see the jihad of Taliban in Afghanistan? And I'm wondering whether perhaps it also means the question that, is that considered jihad? The Taliban, what we term as the Taliban insurgency.
Right, right. So if, well, again, I think we have to be, in dealing with these groups, whether it's ISIS or whether it's Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, I think the emphasis needs to be not on jus ad bellum, not on their professed goals, but on the means that they're using in trying to achieve those goals. The goals, there can be dispute among Muslims in good faith about what an Islamic State is. There can be discussion of what it means to order Muslim political life in the modern age, whether it's in some kind of Islamic state or secular state or whatnot. We have to remember that most Muslims today live in secular states. Most Muslims today live in secular states. So I think these kinds of jus ad bellum concerns are not the focus. The focus is on how the jihad is being waged. If the jihad is being waged in indiscriminate ways, then of course it is the obligation of all of us as Muslim scholars and intellectuals to argue against it, to challenge it. If the party that is conducting warfare in an illegitimate way is the state, then we have a duty to challenge the state. We have a duty to say this is not the correct way that any Muslim should prosecute jihad or prosecute war. So in the case of the Taliban, I have a lot of differences with the Taliban ideology, their conception of an Islamic state. But what I, as a just war or a jihad thinker, would focus on more is the means. And anytime that the means become indiscriminate, anytime that the means violate the strictures of jihad, then I am prepared to challenge the means that are employed, regardless of who is doing the violation.
Thank you so much, Sohail. I know we have many more questions, and I'm afraid that we will not be able to get to all of them. We have such a wonderful, very engaged audience. Perhaps we might have a part 2 of this conversation, but I know that Rutaba did want to ask one final question, and since she has the prerogative of being the moderator, I'm going to let her do that. And then we'll have to then wrap it up. So Rutaba, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. So it's just out of curiosity because, we run Model OIC in Pakistan, and we engage with a lot of young people and peers. I'm just wondering, how can maybe young Muslims sort of reclaim the discourse on jihad, especially when there are so many misperceptions and other fringe groups taking the lead on it. And a lot of young Muslims want to either disassociate themselves completely from this conversation. What feedback or advice would you have to young Muslims on taking back the discourse on jihad?
Boy, that's a very, very difficult question to answer in a brief period of time, but I think you're all doing exactly the right thing. Study, learn, think for yourselves, engage in conversations, do exactly what you're doing now, be part of educational enterprises such as Model OIC. Indeed, I don't know if there's a Model UN program, in Pakistan at the University of Karachi, but if there is a model UN program, it would be wonderful to have some kind of synergy between model UN and model OIC. You could perhaps simulate a General Assembly debate while the OIC is also meeting to discuss the same topic. But I do have one very concrete, and some might consider this a rather superficial or pedestrian suggestion, but I'm going to make it anyway. I have tried my best to try to reclaim the idea of jihad as, again, what I've been discussing throughout our meeting today, as limited warfare, because clearly there is no other way to define it. If you look at the Quranic verses, the Prophet's teachings to us and his practice, and the very rich tradition of Muslim scholarship, jihad is never total warfare. It is never unrestrained warfare. So one of the problems is the very use of the terminology. What do we call the militants? What do we call Al-Qaeda? What was ISIS called routinely? Even among Muslims, they're called jihadis. Am I correct? They're called jihadis. What we have done is basically allow them to monopolize the understanding of this term. And I know that this is a concern for scholars of jihad, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, because we have left the field basically and said, okay, you militants, by calling you jihadis, basically you define jihad. So one of the first things we need to do is to disassociate the actions of anyone, whether it's a state actor or a non-state actor. We need to disassociate their actions from jihad when they violate the principles of jihad. I don't think we should be using that term jihadi willy-nilly, loosely. We need to be very, very careful in the deployment of that term. In fact, I'd be very happy if that term were not used at all. So after 9/11, there were suggestions that an alternative term would be hirabi, someone who wages war that is not in accord with the teachings of jihad. That didn't catch on, obviously. But I think we need to have this discussion because clearly this is one very small thing we can do to reclaim jihad, which is what the question was all about.
Thank you so much for ending on such a poignant note, Sohail. That is such a pet peeve of mine personally, I'm sure a lot of other people, how we tend to use the word jihadist, how we use the word Islamic State for ISIS, almost confusing a huge majority of the population in terms of what are we actually talking about. And so it's so important to at least reclaim the terminology before we start reclaiming the concept itself. I'd like to thank you so much for taking such a complex subject and making it so accessible to so many of us. And we can't thank you enough. On behalf of Critical Connections and NMOIC, I would like to thank you for your time and your generosity with your wisdom. I'd also like to thank everybody who joined us today, and thank you for your excellent questions and your insights. We hope you will join us for future events. And if there's enough interest, we'll have Dr. Sohail Hashmi back, because I know the questions just keep on coming. So, we would love to have a part 2 of this discussion. I'd also just like to thank the NMOIC team. First of all, Rutaba Tariq for being the brains behind this event. Also, Mariam Shakil, who is our project lead, and she was the one who was doing all the groundwork and was an integral part of this event. So, Mariam, thank you so much. Also, Batul Dad, Asher Wilson is also an integral aspect of this entire organization. So I'd like to thank all of these incredible young people and just turn it over to Mariam now, Mariam Shakil, to just say the last few words.
Well, I'd really like to thank you, Dr. Hashmi, for joining us and, with your esteemed presence. So it's been a pleasure to hear to you, and to everyone who has joined us, all the participants. Thank you very much for your time, patience, and well-articulated and well-thought questions. We are sorry for not entertaining all the questions, but we hope you have learned something from here. As in National MOIC Pakistan, we always aim for people to learn and to be aware of what's going on in world affairs. So stay connected to National Embassy of Pakistan, Critical Connections, and thank you, Ms. Mehlaqa, for giving us the opportunity for doing this again. And stay connected to us for further episodes that we'll be releasing soon on our Facebook page, and both on Critical Connections and National Embassy of Pakistan. Thank you.
And we will have a recording of this event, and we will put this up on our social media platforms. So please stay tuned.